Lysis by Miss Nihilist, Chapter 4, Phase 3, Expression. As the virus particles approach the site of replication, the viral genome becomes exposed to cellular machinery for viral gene expression, a process termed uncoding. Getting the jump on Rook wasn't difficult at all. Ben knew his partner's schedule, so all he and Elena had to do was wait until Rook stopped for lunch. Ben snuck after him into Burger Shack and tackled Rook to the ground. "Hold him down!" Ben shouted at Elena as he grappled with Rook on the tile floor. The other customers screamed and ran out the front door, a couple of them hanging out to record what was happening through the window. Elena was quick to do as told. Her microchips swarmed over Rook's ankles and wrists, forming tight chains that pinned his flailing limbs to the floor. "What is this? Release me immediately," Rook snapped. "Ben, I will file an incident report with Magister Tennyson as soon as— Ow!" He reflexively tried to bite Ben's fingers as he dug them into the skin around Rook's jaw and chin. Ben felt for a seam, but found nothing. "It's not an ID mask," he announced, sitting back where he was straddling Rook's waist. "What?" Rook shot Ben an incredulous look. "Of course I'm not wearing an ID mask. How stupid are you?" Ben ignored him and glanced up at Elena. "Do you think your chips could make an MRI machine? We should check his brain for alien parasites or some kind of anger module." "People have to hold still for an MRI scan," Elena pointed out. "And I don't think Rook is going to cooperate." As if to prove her point, Rook thrashed harder against her microchips, bucking his head this way and that. "Good point." Ben frowned and thought. He didn't let himself linger on one failed piece of evidence, and was instead trying to come up with a question that only Rook would know the answer to. Thankfully, a good one came to him quickly. "Rook, when we were on the Contumelia's ship to stop Maltruant, what did the Contumelia look like to you?" Rook didn't seem confused by the question, which was a good sign probably. His anger remained, though, and he bared his fangs at Ben. "If I tell you, will you release me?" "Yes," Ben nodded. "Fine. I saw my father," Rook answered with a roll of his eyes. Elena gave Ben a questioning look. "That's the right answer," Ben assured her, "but don't let him up just yet." Rook, of course, was only further pissed off by that and thrashed like he was trying to prove it. "As soon as I am out of this," he growled as Elena's restraints tightened, "I am going to make you regret it." So far, they had managed to rule out an evil clone, a robotic replacement, an alien wearing an ID mask. Ben plucked one of Rook's strands of fur and wished for a moment that he'd remembered to bring a plastic bag. "Here," Elena said as she handed Ben exactly that. Ben blinked, taken aback. He remembered Elena once telling him that the chips could give her everything she wanted, but it kept surprising him whenever it was shown just how literally Elena meant it. It made Ben ache for what could have been. Instant housing, no need for menial labor, taking the burden of construction and mining off of the environment without having to sacrifice quality of living. Her technology could have changed the world. He recovered from his surprise and dropped Rook's hair into the bag. "Thanks," Ben thought for a moment. "Can you make, like, a syringe?" "You want a blood sample too?" Elena asked. Obviously, Rook was not happy about this idea, but Ben was fine with ignoring his growling and struggling. "I mean," Ben made a face. "We can't take any brain scans, and it could be some sort of alien disease, right? It's spreading, so maybe someone is using a behavior-altering gas, or it's a brain-eating amoeba. If it's a biological weapon, then it'll leave some sort of trace in the blood, right?" Elena tilted her head, considering it. "It can't hurt to check," she agreed. She brought her hands together, and microchips swarmed over her palms. Too fast for Ben's eyes to track, a sterile surgical syringe had formed in her hands. Before Ben could even ask, Elena was already using more of her chips to hold Rook's twisting, thrashing head still. He bared his teeth, but thankfully held still when the tip of the needle punctured his neck. Rook's glare was focused on Ben, like he was trying to burn a hole straight through him. Ben refused to look at Rook. He couldn't take seeing hatred that intense on his best friend's face. "Got it." Elena straightened up, holding the now blood-filled syringe. "We can examine this back at my old lab. If nothing else, a microscope will be useful." "Good idea. Let's go." Ben held himself tall and walked briskly. He led the way out of the restaurant without looking back. Outside, he transformed into Big Chill for the short flight. Elena waited until they were both airborne to release the microchips restraining Rook. Despite his anger and his threats, Rook didn't try to chase after them. Ben wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Elena's old research lab was, thankfully, still in fine condition. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, but the building hadn't been rented out to someone else or broken into. Once her microscope was dusted off, Elena pressed the hair that they got from Rook and a drop of his blood into separate, freshly cleaned slides and got to work. Ben drummed his fingers against his arm as he waited, struggling not to pace. Riling himself up wouldn't do any good, but it was hard to force himself to do nothing when every bit of him was itching to jump into action. A moment spent standing still felt like a moment wasted. He forced himself to count to 100 in his head before he spoke up. "Find anything unusual?" Ben asked. He wasn't sure how long microbiology took, but surely it couldn't take more than a minute or two to tell if something was wrong, right? "I'm not sure." Elena didn't look up, but there was a frown on her face. "Rook is an alien, so all of his cells look unusual to me. And my specialty is in engineering, not biology." It was tempting to ask if he could take a look himself, but Ben doubted that he would know better than Elena. He dug his fingers into his arms and pursed his lips, waiting as patiently as he could. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to about 10 minutes, Elena made a soft hum. "That's odd," she mused. "What is it? What's odd?" Ben was hovering at her side in an instant, staring at the blood sample slide as if he would be able to see something unusual about it with just his eyes. "See for yourself." Elena stepped back and waved him over. "Just don't touch the microscope. I'll adjust it for you." Ben did as told, stepping closer and pressing his eyes to the eyepieces. There were plenty of different-looking cells drifting about in Rook's plasma. Ben didn't know enough about biology to tell any of them apart, though. They all looked like crudely drawn red circles to him. "From what I can tell, the larger cells are your typical animal body cells," Elena explained. "They're similar enough to ours that I feel comfortable making that assumption anyway. But when you look closer..." There was the sound of the microscope clicking as she zoomed in, bringing one cell into sharp focus. Ben still didn't see anything noteworthy, until Elena zoomed in a second time. The cell that had seemed so tiny suddenly took up most of Ben's vision, a dark red smear next to the pink-tinted plasma it was swimming in. But swimming next to the cell, too tiny for Ben to have noticed before, was a cell that looked like no more than a gray squiggle. "That," Elena said, answering before Ben could even ask, "is a virus." Ben sucked in a breath through his teeth. His grip on the table tightened and his knuckles ached. "Do you think that's what's causing everyone to act so weird?" "Well, it's more complicated than that," Elena admitted. When Ben pulled back to look at her, she was frowning, worrying her bottom lip between her teeth thoughtfully. "There are viruses everywhere, all the time. Just because there's one attacking Rick's cells right now doesn't mean that they're necessarily the reason behind his odd behavior." "Okay, that makes sense." Ben took a moment to consider his options. "There has to be a way to tell what a virus does, though, right?" "If we could sequence its genome, sure," Elena agreed. "But I don't have the equipment for that, and even if I did, I wouldn't know where to start." Ben did his best to look optimistic, giving a carefree wave of his hand. "No worries. I know someone who can help us out." Elena's frown only deepened. "Are you sure? If this is a virus, Ben, we have no idea how far it could have spread by now. How can you be certain this person will be willing to help?" "I'm going to ask Azimuth. He lives 72,000 light-years away, so he should be unaffected," Ben assured her. Even though Elena nodded, she still didn't seem convinced. "And if he's not?" Ben took a deep breath. "I'll cross that bridge when I get to it." What else could he do? The virus that they'd found in Rook's blood sample was the only lead that Ben had, and he would follow it until he couldn't anymore. If it didn't get him the answers that he was looking for, he would start over with a different lead. Maybe everyone that Ben knew had simply fallen victim to a serial hypnotist. He had fought so many people over the years that he had to have someone like that in his rogues gallery, right? "All right, if that's what you want to do." Elena masked her concern and nodded. She gave the best smile that she could muster. "I just hope you weren't thinking of going alone." The offer to come along made Ben relax marginally. He gave a sheepish shrug. "I didn't want to assume." "I won't leave your side," Elena assured him with a steely look. She paused then, seeming to reconsider. "Unless you ask me to, I mean..." A part of Ben wanted to let it go. After all, there were much more important things they needed to be doing than having this conversation. But for the sake of transparency and not letting things get awkward or tense, Ben knew that it had to come up eventually. "Elena..." He hesitated, not quite sure how to word it. I appreciate how helpful you've been, but we're not..." He gestured between the two of them helplessly. Elena's smile turned tight at the edges, but then Ben blinked and it was gone. "I know," she said quietly. "Trust me, I'm not expecting anything, Ben. My feelings are..." She searched for the right words. "I still have them, but I'm not the crazy, obsessive psycho that I was last time." She tried her best to laugh it off. The sound made Ben's chest squeeze in pity. "You weren't crazy, Elena." He caught her hand, giving a reassuring squeeze. "You were just in pain. I'm sorry that I couldn't help you." The way that Elena looked at him was so unguarded and fond that Ben had to tear his eyes away, uncomfortable. "You tried," she settled on. And I appreciate that more than you'll ever know. Ben wanted to say more, but Elena was shaking her head before he could. Don't worry about that now. The important thing is that I'm doing better. And anyway, we should get going. Viruses spread fast. Let's not waste time. Ben steeled himself and gave a nod. Yeah, you're right. The sooner we can put this whole mess behind us, the better. He glanced over at the work table, where Elena's microscope slides, the syringe, and the bag with Rick's hair sample were still sitting. So, weird question. How long do you think you could hold the shape of a bag? Since all of Ben's allies were brainwashed and he didn't own a space cruiser, his only option for getting to Galvin Prime was flying there himself. Jet Ray could travel those 72,000 light years in a few minutes, which was great for Ben, but made it difficult for Ben to take anyone with him. Luckily, Elena could shapeshift. It was a bit of a goofy solution, Ben had to admit, but he was short on options and didn't have the patience to figure out something that looked less silly. Once he transformed into Jet Ray, Elena let her human figure dissolve into a swarm of humming microchips. They surrounded Ben for a moment like a cloud of angry wasps. Then they condensed to hug his skin, taking the shape of a belt snug around his hips that had a small pouch just big enough to hold their evidence. Ben made sure that the belt, Elena, was secure before he took off. As Jet Ray broke Earth's atmosphere and then its gravitational pull, Ben slowly increased his speed so that Elena could compensate. Thankfully, she didn't have an issue hanging on. Her belt might as well have been another layer of his skin. Jet Ray beat his wings through the void of space, propelling himself to speeds well over the speed of light. He headed in the general direction of Galvin Prime, navigating mostly by getting close enough to planets to recognize them and slowing down to adjust his course accordingly. Not that Galvin Prime was hard to find. Their star system was surrounded by a cloud of space debris as a last warning to trespassers, and there was a Dyson sphere made of satellites orbiting the white supergiant that acted as Galvin Prime's sun. It was kind of hard to miss. Jet Ray slowed as he reached the outer edges of the planet's atmosphere. Galvin Prime's security system immediately recognized the Omnitrix, and it let him come in for a landing without challenging him. He circled the planet a few times before he found Asmus' lab, soaring over Galvin Prime's largest city and zeroing in on the building that towered over all the others. Jet Ray set himself down on the roof. He didn't have the patience for using the front door today. With a flash, Ben transformed back into his human self. He tapped the side of the pouch at his hips, and the cloth-like material quivered and became almost like a liquid as it peeled itself away from his body. A couple feet away, the swarm of microchips took on Elena's familiar silhouette, then condensed and solidified. She was holding the samples they'd brought with them. Once her face was finished reforming, she gave Ben a reassuring smile. "See?" Elena said lightly. "Nothing to it, and you were worried I wouldn't be able to hold on." Ben let himself return the smile. "Yeah, well, I guess it's a good thing that there's no wind in space to create drag." He looked around and found the roofing panel that would give them access to the inside. He held the Omnitrix over the security scanner and it beeped softly, unlocking for him. Ben pried the access hatch open and waved Elena over. "Come on, I know the way to Asmus' lab. Stick behind me." "Nowhere else I'd rather be," Elena assured him. Ben didn't bother reminding her that he wasn't interested in flirting, and, admittedly, the compliment was nice after the way everyone else had been treating him. He just nodded and led the way inside. It was a tight squeeze through the Galvin-sized hallways, but thankfully they were designed bigger than necessary because the workers at Asmus' lab often had to move machinery and parts that were several times bigger than they were. Closer to Asmus' main lab, the halls widened to the point that Ben could stand straight up instead of walking hunched over. As they walked, they passed the occasional Galvin scientist. Ben didn't linger to chat with them. They had never been helpful in the past, and he was almost scared to see if they would respond negatively to his presence or not. He supposed that he was just grateful to see them ignoring him for the most part. It gave him hope that Asmus would also be normal. Elena trailed behind him, occasionally lagging as she slowed to stare at something out of one of the many enormous windows. She would hurry to catch up with Ben once she noticed him getting further ahead, though, so he didn't mind. Ben was doing his best to stay calm and find small things to be grateful for so that he didn't get stuck in a rut by focusing on what a shitty situation he was in. Small things, like the fact that Elena was here with him, making sure that Ben didn't have to face this alone. Or how it was actually kind of cute that she would stare out over the Galvin city with big eyes and an odd grin. Ben often forgot that not everyone had been to alien planets before, and he had to admit that Galvin Prime was a particularly pretty one. Finally, though, they arrived. Ben had been here enough times to know that the huge, gaudy door, several times bigger than would ever be needed, was definitely Asmuth's. Part of the door was made with green-tinted glass, and, through it, Ben could see Asmuth engrossed in something he was studying at a desk on the far side of the lab. Asmuth's back was to the door, though, so Ben had no idea if his presence was even expected, let alone welcome. He raised his hand to the access panel, ready to wave the Omnitrix over to unlock the door, and hesitated. Elena noticed. Of course she did. She set a gentle hand between Ben's shoulder blades. "Hey," she murmured. "Are you all right?" "It's just..." Ben almost didn't answer, but Elena had asked him about this possibility when they were back on Earth, and he knew that she wouldn't judge him for it. Ben swallowed hard. What if it's already too late? If Azimuth won't help us, what am I supposed to do? He turned his head to look at her, silently asking for answers or guidance. "I don't know," Elena admitted truthfully. "But there's options. It might be harder or take longer to figure this out without his help, but I'm not going to leave you, Ben. Whatever happens, I'm with you all the way." It was probably supposed to be comforting. Ben smiled, but even as he let himself be reassured by Elena's words, some part of him couldn't help but wonder if she was making a promise or a threat. If he was wrong about the virus, then that just made it more likely that Elena had done something after all. Either way, though, Ben would never know until he moved forward. He took a deep breath to steady himself and pushed the button that would open the door. As soon as the door to his lab slid open, Azimuth whirled around with a sharp scowl on his face, ready to tell off whoever was interrupting his work. Once he saw it was Ben, that expression deepened. Ben felt a pit open up in his stomach.
"You never bother calling ahead, Tennyson. Have you considered that I have more important things to do than clean up your messes?" Azimuth growled. "Can't you see that I'm busy? Leave, or I will have my security escort you out."
Elena winced, giving Ben a pained look. Even as his heart hammered away in his ribcage, though, Ben forced himself to stay optimistic. "Azimuth is always grumpy," he told Elena offhandedly, "but he wants to help, deep down. Here, watch." Ben cleared his throat and took a step closer. "It'll be quick. I just need you to take a look at these blood samples we have and tell me if—"
"No!"
Azimuth raised his voice to cut Ben off sharply.
"I want both of you out of my lab now. In fact, leave the planet entirely. Ben, you aren't welcome on Galvin Prime, and neither is anyone who considers you a friend."
Frustrated, Ben dropped his polite act entirely. "You're smarter than this, Azimuth," he argued. He stalked up to Azimuth, meeting his glare head-on with one of his own. "Come on, you have to know that you're being messed with. You like me, remember? Why else would you help me all those times in the past? Why else would you let me keep the Omnitrix?" He gestured wildly to the device. "The day we met, you even said you liked me." He was close enough to actually watch the struggle of emotions on Azimuth's face. His face creased in discomfort and frustration as he floundered for the right words. There was almost a flicker of something in his eyes, and then Azimuth's expression closed off like a door being slammed shut.
"That was then,"
Azimuth stubbornly settled on.
"and this is now. Now, I strongly suggest that you leave before I decide to take back my Omnitrix from you."
Ben opened his mouth to retort, only for Elena to set a hand on his forearm and gently tug him back. "I don't think a direct approach is going to work," she murmured. "Maybe we can try something more subtle?" Subtlety wasn't his strong suit, but Ben knew that she was right. He frowned and thought. After a moment, Ben turned back to Azimuth. "Okay, well," he said, "if you won't help, can we borrow a microscope and one of your lab assistants?" Azimuth snorted incredulously.
"Absolutely not. Are you truly so thick that you can't understand the meaning of a 2-letter word?"
Ben rolled his eyes. "Well, hating me aside, this is definitely still Azimuth," he muttered to himself. Elena's hand was still resting on his arm, and she used her light grip to tug Ben to the side, turning away from Azimuth entirely and leaning into him. "I don't think this is going to work," she told Ben with a worried frown. "And his threat sounds serious. We'll make even slower progress without the Omnitrix. I think we should try moving on without Azimuth's help." "How?" Ben was unable to keep the desperate note out of his voice. "Where are we supposed to go from here?" "Let's just move forward with the virus theory," Elena suggested. "If we act like it's already true, we can find a way to cure it, and if that doesn't work, then we know that we were wrong." "Okay, but how are we going to—" "Wait." Ben's eyes widened. An idea had occurred to him, striking him like someone had thrown a brick at his head. Slowly, a grin inched its way onto his face. "If this was a virus, it would only work on living things, right?" Elena tilted her head in confusion. Yes. Viruses need living cells to reproduce, but that doesn't really narrow anything down." Ben turned away from her and whirled on Azimuth. He was so giddy that he had to clench his fists against the urge to jump for joy. "Does Eunice still work for you?" His question was so out of nowhere that, for a second, all of the hatred and annoyance was wiped off of Azimuth's face, and he could only blink.
"What? Yes, she does, but why?"
"What planet is she doing research on?" Ben asked immediately, cutting him off.
Well, there's a planet on the outer Monsero system that I've been meaning to.
Azimuth stopped himself there as he remembered himself, shaking his head and snapping,
It's none of your business. This is your last chance to leave, Ben. Your behavior is appalling, and if the plumbers agree with me, I will be ordering you to relinquish the Omnitrix. I'm certain that I could toss it out the window and hit a far more worthy champion than you've ever been.
Ben didn't focus on anything Azimuth said after he heard Monsero's system. He wasn't sure where that was, but he knew how to find out. If this was a virus, then no wonder Elena wasn't affected. She was an inorganic being. That meant Eunice wouldn't be affected either. And if he showed up and Eunice hated him too, then, well, at least Ben would know that it wasn't a virus, and then he and Elena could try a different approach. Don't worry, Azimuth, I'm getting out of your hair. He turned to the exit and took hold of Elena's hand without breaking stride. Come on, let's go borrow a plumber cruiser. Behind them, Azimuth sputtered indignantly. Ben ignored him. He exited the lab and let the door slide shut behind him, cutting off Azimuth's protests. We're going to the, Monsero system? Elena asked. When Ben nodded, her brow furrowed in confusion. Why are we borrowing a ship? I don't know where that is, and even if I did, the computer system on board will be able to tell us which of the planets in the system are habitable. That'll narrow down our search, and my Omnitrix will sync with Eunice's Unitrix when we get close enough, helping us track her. Ben explained his thought process, all without looking at Elena. In his head, Ben was jumping for joy. He still had a grin on his face. He clutched Elena's hand tightly, but his eyes were all over the place as he walked briskly down the hall. As soon as he found the maintenance elevator, Ben shuttled Elena onto it and hit the button for the lowest level, the cargo bay. He knew that stealing a plumber cruiser would piss Azimuth off, and probably a bunch of the plumber higher-ups too. But Ben didn't care at the moment. He would deal with that once he solved the more pressing problem. That all makes sense. Elena's frown didn't fade. She hesitated. Don't get your hopes up too much, Ben, she said gently. Ben knew that she was right, and that was the only reason he didn't snap at her. He looked away, forcing his fist to unclench at his sides. Ben swallowed. I'll do my best, was the best that he could offer. Elena tried for a smile. You always do, she said. When she reached down to take hold of his hand, Ben let her. He didn't trust Elena, but he wanted to. And now, he finally had a reason to. Eunice was an artificial intelligence in an inorganic body, so she would be immune to a virus. She was wicked smart, and she knew how to navigate Azimuth's technology too. With her help, Ben was certain that an antidote could be made in no time, and everything would be back to normal. It was his light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. Finally, Ben had a solid lead.